Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Australia's newest airline is in trouble. Budget carrier Bonza yesterday went into voluntary administration after cancelling flights across the country. It only officially began operating in January last year, but for some, the development does not come as a surprise. Neil Hansford is an international aviation consultant. He spent more than 40 years providing business plan assessments to airlines. When Bonza first announced its plans to launch a new low-cost airline, Neil declared it only had a 5% chance of success. And on that front, unfortunately, he appears to have been correct. Neil, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Pleasure.
So what went wrong? Was it the business model of Bonza? What were they sort of trying to take on established players was just too hard?
Well, the business model was unlikely to work in Australia. It's a problem of trying to provide an all-leisure airline on routes that are fundamentally too thin with an aircraft that was 180 seats and new and having all the costs of a new aircraft and all the costs of setting up. Okay,
so it's in voluntary administration. What about the fact that it was owned by it was a private owner, it was the US private investment firm 777 Partners. Given what you just said then, when you don't have a major carrier behind you, how much harder is it?
All the 777 Partners gave them was access to aircraft, a cheer squad, and working capital. And the working capital obviously wasn't enough. I don't think the business plan was robust enough to be able to see that I doubt if this airline had made a profit for 1 day, 1 week or 1 hour. So It doesn't take long to burn through the bucket of money. At the same time, 777 Partners have got all of their own problems in the United States.
Okay, so with the airline Bonza, so is it fuel costs, it's fees, landing fees, those sorts of things, it's obviously staffing costs. Are they all the big costs for an airline outside literally the leasing cost of the airline itself and whatnot? Are they the ones that it's kind of the cost base just too great to be competitive in a thin market?
It's a very thin market, and the aircraft is, very few airlines, when they've started in the low-cost area, have started with brand new aircraft with a reputational problem that the 737-8 had in a market where Qantas and Virgin are not going to sit back and watch somebody eat their lunch. So it was always difficult, but the particular routes, and I said it before it ever started, these routes are not going to give you enough traffic. They didn't understand the basic rules that unless you're getting business market and getting proper yields of people who will pay the right fare, you have your back to the wall. And you can fill an aircraft like this to 180 seats, but if it's all at the wrong fare, you will go nowhere but down.
Okay, and so you don't think there's a way back? It is voluntary administration for Bonza. You don't think there's a way they can work through it?
No, I looked at Hall Chadwick, who are the voluntary administrators. No names jumped out at me that these people know anything about the macro industry, let alone knowing the nuances of a low-cost leisure airline flying on routes that are too thin and not providing enough services a week. So it is one challenge too big for anybody.
Okay, so there were reports yesterday that Bonza's aircraft are being repossessed. In fact, one report there was actually an aircraft on the ground, and passengers were kicked off because they said, "Sorry, this is being repossessed." How does that actually work? I mean, how does the nuts and bolts of repossessing an aircraft work?
The nuts and bolts of you obviously have the right paperwork to support you, and you go and you say, "Well, I've got a lien, I'm taking possession, and this aircraft's not going to move." And then they would be in the process of organising, repatriating the aircraft quickly out of Australia and getting it into some other location where they can start getting some lease payments.
Stay with me, Neil. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to international aviation consultant Neil Hansford. So if you look at the landscape generally, we think of Qantas Link, Rex is another one. I presume if these routes were commercially viable, they would have jumped in anyway. But what about those sorts of, I mean, Qantas Link is different because it's part of Qantas, but Rex, Regional Express, how does that survive?
Well, it's got a very old fleet where, other than the 737s, the Saabs are 30-odd years old. So the capital cost of the aircraft which they own don't have a heavy burden. And the other point is they don't offer fares that are in the gutter. They offer fares that is going to give them a chance of providing the service and the integrity and, most of all, satisfying the requirements of the regulator CASA.
Okay, so it looks like Bonza's likely to not fly. Is there room for another airline, for another operator, if the economics, or if they're charging fair prices, if they can get landing slots at Sydney Airport, et cetera, is there room for another airline?
No.
Right.
Basically, Australia's got because of our population and the spread of our population, we don't have enough people to have 4 or 5 airlines. And whilst ever we as Australians require the service levels, we're not very forgiving. We want the world. We want to pay nothing for it. And no matter how well Virgin and Qantas are going at the moment, this can only be expected to continue. And if there is a route that's not being serviced, there's no way in the world that people like Steph Tully at Jetstar won't be looking to how they put the right equipment on that route. And that's why Qantas have got their relationships with people like Alliance. They operate turboprops. They can match the market with the right size aircraft.
So that means we're left basically with the aircraft that we have now in terms of the parent brands Qantas and Virgin and their offspring. Is that competitive enough for this market? What's it mean for airfares, that type of thing?
Well, if you look in percentage terms, it's not like the figures that you're going to get for Coles and Woolworths in the Senate inquiry. This is not an industry that, if it was any other industry than airlines, if it was a coal mine and you were getting the return on your funds employed that the airlines get, if it was a coal mine, you'd close it. So
right.
we have special sort of circumstances for this industry, but this industry, I haven't seen yields above 10% for a very long time. In pre-COVID, you were seeing 18s and 19s, and those airlines are now doing 2s and 3s. So it's not the next place to make your fortune. And the biggest problem is the big 4 banks in Australia have little to no appetite for aviation.
Sorry, can you explain that? Can you break that down for me? It's not an area I'm familiar with. And you were saying yields gone from 18% to 2% post-COVID. Is that because not as many people are travelling? I'm just... so. No,
I was aware... I was talking pre-COVID. There was airlines in the States making 19%.
Okay. Right. Okay.
Look, give you a historical thing. The kangaroo route, London to Sydney, there was only 1 year in 40 that every airline on that route made money, and the highest was 3 to 4%.
Okay. Now, in the last few days, there was an interesting report out from JP Morgan. This is along the same lines, Neil, that you've been discussing. It basically was looking at capacity, market share, revenue on 10 of Australia's busiest routes. Now, on the Melbourne-Sydney route, the busiest route, Qantas had 5% more market share than Virgin Australia, but it made almost twice as much revenue. 5% extra, twice as much revenue. Also, double the revenue on Brisbane to Sydney, carrying 20% more passengers. How's that work?
It's basically yield management, and you got the big distortion, the Qantas frequent flyer, where people who are spending often somebody else's money, like their employer, will go on Qantas at any price and not as price sensitive, and they choose to go Qantas to get their frequent flyer where they've got 16 million members. So it's all a case of who's getting the right sort of people setting up the front of the aircraft that's paying a disproportionate cost of the aircraft operations against those who are sitting at the back.
Fair enough. One final question for you, Neil. What about Virgin? If it does list, it's a bit different because it's privately owned now, but if it does list, can it be a competitive player earn a return on investment for shareholders, assuming it lists this is, given what you just said about Qantas?
Yes, it will. It will do that. But there is a very clear market, and I come from an ex-Ansett perspective that it will take two players, but you've got to have a lot of infrastructure behind you, like frequent flyers and all the things that the business community require.
Neil, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Pleasure.
That was international aviation consultant Neil Hansford. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.